Okay, good day, students of NST1501. Welcome to our third lesson. Our content that we'll be covering today is cell structure and function. The first thing that I want to go through is a couple of definitions. The first definition I'd like to go through is the definition of a cell. So a cell is the basic unit of life. All living things are made up of cells, and cells are the site of metabolism. So much like in our previous section where we did atoms, and atoms are the building blocks of matter, cells are the building blocks of life. So all living organisms are made up of cells. When I said that cells are the site of metabolism, I'm referring to metabolism, the functions that at cellular level are necessary to keep the body alive. So a lot of the times when we think of metabolism, we think of a human's body and breaking down of food and all of that. But metabolism is a general term referring to any functions that are responsible to sustain life. And depending on the type of cell, it would be responsible for a different type of metabolic process. Then our next definition is prokaryotic cells. Now, I've put this separate to eukaryotic cells, even though they are opposite to each other. We study eukaryotic cells, the other cells, a lot more in detail. The reason that we do this is because prokaryotic cells are very, very simple cells. They are cells with no true nucleus, and they are almost always single-celled, like bacteria, and they can be microscopic. So prokaryotic cells are, you can see it in the picture on the slide. When I say no true nucleus, so we get into organelles, and we're going to speak about a nucleus in a bit, but the cell could still contain genetic material like DNA or RNA, but it's not contained within a nucleus. So there's no membrane surrounding this DNA or RNA, and therefore we refer to it as a prokaryotic cell. Our next definition is a chromosome. So a chromosome is a thread-like structure of genetic material found in the nucleus. However, if it's a prokaryotic cell, we could still get a chromosome that contains DNA, but again, this chromosome will not be contained in a nucleus. Therefore, it will be called a prokaryotic cell. So chromosome is very, very important for when we study genetics and hereditary diseases and all of that. Because all of these hereditary diseases are contained and carried on chromosomes. Chromosomes are not very valid for this section, but it's good to know about them and to understand them. So if we had to look at that little diagram of a prokaryotic cell, and you see the label of DNA, and this is actually in your study material, this little diagram, this is where I took it from. So if you have a look at all the little squiggly stuff that's labeled DNA, that squiggly stuff we refer to as chromosomes. They're thread-like and they contain genetic material. Okay, let's move on. Okay, then we want to speak to eukaryotic cells. So eukaryotic cells are cells that have a true nucleus. So true nucleus is a nucleus that is surrounded by a nuclear membrane. And they may be single-celled or multicellular, and all metabolic processes are controlled by enzymes. So a eukaryotic cell has many different structures inside of it, and it's a lot more complex than a prokaryotic cell, and there's therefore a lot more to understand about a eukaryotic cell, and that is why we study these in more detail, and this would be like the normal animal and plant cell that we learn about. Then again, I've referred to something called enzymes. So enzymes are specific proteins that assist in carrying out functions. So a different enzyme would be responsible for a different process and a different function. We don't necessarily need to know which enzyme is responsible for which function unless we are studying this function in detail. And then an organelle. So if you think of an organ inside a human's body, These are the different things that make the body work. So organelles are the different little things inside a cell that have their own different little functions and aim to carry out a specific task. Some organelles are not found in every single cell, depending firstly if it's a plant cell or an animal cell, and then also depending on where you find the cell. Is it in a human, for example? Is it in any other type of animal? That would determine what type of organelles you would find. But we do study certain organelles, especially the ones that are common in animal and plant cells, quite in detail, just to understand what their specific function is. Let's move on. So organelles. So in this diagram of a cell, now firstly, even though it's not the point of the image, this is an animal cell. Firstly, the reason I know it's an animal cell is because I look at the shape, and it's not a very rigid shape. So it's not square, rectangle, or like got sharp edges. And also it doesn't have a cell wall, which gives it this shape. So it's quite irregularly shaped. So this is kind of oval, kind of round, but it's not as rigid or as tight in shape as a plant cell would be. So a plant cell is encased by a cell wall and a cell membrane, where an animal cell only has a cell membrane. We also refer to a cell membrane as a plasma membrane. Both of them are correct terms for the same thing. So there's many different little organelles in this cell that we are looking at, and many organelles that we don't necessarily need to study in detail right now. However, it's generally the big ones that we pay a lot of attention to, except for ribosomes. So ribosomes are quite tiny, but they're very, very important. We study mitochondria, we study the nucleus, something that is not in this cell, but a chloroplast, we would study that as well. Maybe even the endoplasmic reticulum. So it just depends on which section and how in detail we want to go with the cell. So I'm going to go through a few different organelles and their function and why it makes the cell that it is, and what does it have to do for the life of the organism that it's in. So the first one we are going to have a look at is a cell membrane. So cell membrane, again, also referred to as the plasma membrane. So I showed you where it is labeled on the diagram. The plasma membrane or the cell membrane, or even the cytoplasmic membrane, which is a third name for it, which is also correct because it's the membrane that encloses the cytoplasm. It's a selectively permeable membrane of the cells, which is composed of a lipid bilayer and proteins. A lot of big words in that sentence. So firstly, selectively permeable. So selectively means it chooses. So it's choosing something. Permeable means that substances can move through it. So if it's selectively permeable, it allows certain substances in and out, and certain substances cannot be let into the cell, obviously because they would be toxic or harmful to the cell. So how can a cell membrane be selectively permeable? It's not that there's security guards standing there saying, no, you're not allowed in, but there is a lipid bilayer. And when we speak about the transport mechanisms across the membrane, you might understand a bit better about why a cell membrane is selectively permeable. Lipid bilayer means lipids, fats. This is what the layer of the cell membrane is made of, and proteins. The plasma membrane is present both in plant and animal cells, and it functions as the selectively permeable membrane by permitting the entry of selective materials in and out of the cell according to the requirement. In an animal cell, the cell membrane functions by providing shape and protects the inner contents of the cell. So in an animal cell, there's no cell wall. So the cell membrane is the outermost layer, so it needs to protect the cell and give it a bit of shape. Okay, let's move on to the next organelle as such. It's the cytoplasm. So would we see the cytoplasm itself as an organ if it was inside the human body? Not necessarily. I would say imagine the blood or the lymph inside the human body. In a cell, the cytoplasm is the fluid that you can find within the cell that everything basically floats in, if you can imagine them floating. So the cytoplasm is present both in plant and animal cells, and they are jelly-like substances found between the cell membrane and the nucleus. So you can see there where I've labeled it. So this is basically inside the cell membrane and between all the little organelles. The cytoplasm is one of the essential components of the cell where all the cell organelles are embedded. These cell organelles contain enzymes, which you spoke about earlier, specific proteins, and these are mainly responsible for controlling all metabolic activity taking place within the cell and are the site for most of the chemical reactions within a cell. Okay, let's move on. So then we're going to focus on the nucleus. Now remember, this nucleus in the cell is what makes it a eukaryotic cell. Is because it's got a true nucleus made of a nucleolus, chromatin, and it's surrounded by a nuclear membrane. So the nucleus is a double membrane organelle found in all eukaryotic cells. It is the largest organelle, which functions as the control center of the cellular activities and is the storehouse of the cell's DNA. So in other words, it is basically the headquarters of the cell. Not necessarily where all the power comes from, but where all the decisions and all the functions are controlled. It is a porous, by structure, the nucleus is dark, round, and surrounded by a nuclear membrane. It is a porous membrane, like a cell membrane, so certain substances can move in and out of it, and it forms a wall between the cytoplasm and the nucleus. So showing you that this is the nucleus. And within the nucleus, there are tiny spherical bodies called nucleolus. It also carries an essential structure called chromosomes. So again, chromosomes, which when they condense and you can't see them individually, we refer to them as chromatin network. But if you had to zoom in and look at the individual little structures, the thread-like structures, those are chromosomes. As previously mentioned, these are the structures that carry the DNA, the genetic information. Okay, let's move on and look at the endoplasmic reticulum. So the endoplasmic reticulum, there you can see it basically surrounds the nucleus. So the endoplasmic reticulum is a network of membranous canals filled with fluid. They are the transport system of the cell, involved in transporting materials throughout the cell. There are two different types of endoplasmic reticulum. We sometimes just refer to it as ER because it's quite a mouthful. So we get the rough endoplasmic reticulum, and these are composed of cisternae, tubules, and vesicles, which are found throughout the cell and are involved in protein manufacture. And then we get the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. They are the storage organelle associated with the production of lipids, steroids, and also responsible for detoxifying the cell. Okay, that's quite an important one, just to remember that the structure that is responsible to detoxify the cell is the smooth ER. So you need to also, when perhaps completing an assessment or a active continuous assessment within the study material based on the different organelles, just try and identify whether the question is referring to endoplasmic reticulum in general or specifically the rough ER or the smooth ER. It's quite easy to identify between the rough ER and the smooth ER because the rough, in the diagrams on the surface is not smooth. That's basically really what it is. The smooth doesn't have little bubbles or little bumps on the surface of it. So that would be the rough, the bumpy one, and the smooth one would not have anything on the little outside layer. Okay, let's move to the next organelle, which is the mitochondria. So the mitochondria is a very important organelle. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. So if you can imagine a power plant generating all the power for the cell to actually carry out its functions. It needs to work in connection with the nucleus, but it is very responsible for providing energy to our cell. So mitochondria is the plural. One of them is a mitochondrion. So mitochondria are called the powerhouses of the cell as they produce energy-rich molecules for the cell. The mitochondrial genome is inherited maternally in several organisms. So what does that mean? So it's inherited from the mother. It is a double membrane-bound, sausage-shaped organelle found in almost all eukaryotic cells. Now, we study mitochondria very much in detail when we look at the process of cellular respiration, which will come up in another lesson. But all cells have mitochondria. The mitochondrial genome is inherited maternally in several I've said the same thing twice there. The mitochondrial genome is inherited maternally, so that's obviously quite important. And yeah, we can see it labeled in this little diagram as a little orange organelle. That's not necessarily the color that it is if you had to look at it under a microscope, but the color coding helps us identify different little organelles. And we could study the mitochondria structure inside it as well in quite detail because different sections are responsible for different steps in cellular respiration. Okay, let's move on to an equally important organelle, which is the chloroplast. Now, the reason why the diagram is a little bit different now is, as previously mentioned, the little structure I was showing you was an animal cell. We knew this because there was no cell wall, and I also knew it because there was no chloroplast, hence that I've changed the diagram. So chloroplast is only found in an animal cell, in a plant cell. Now, why? It's very responsible for a function that only a plant cell can carry out, and this process is photosynthesis. So chloroplasts are double membrane-bound organelles which usually vary in their shape from a disc shape to spherical, discoid, oval, and ribbon. They are present in mesophyll cells of leaves, which store chloroplasts and other carotenoid pigments. So a chloroplast is often green. Well, in diagrams, it's often green. This is actually because it actually is green. It contains a pigment called chlorophyll, which makes it green. These pigments are responsible for trapping light energy for photosynthesis. So without a chloroplast and the chlorophyll contained within it, a plant would not be able to photosynthesize and therefore it would not survive. Okay, let's move to the little organelles, the ribosomes. So ribosomes are back to the original cell we were looking at. I prefer the size and the color. It's quite easy to have a look at. So ribosomes are very, very important in the process of protein synthesis. So synthesizing, making proteins. So the primary function of the ribosome includes protein synthesis in all living cells that ensure the survival of the cell. The primary function of the ribosomes includes protein synthesis in all living cells and ensure the survival of the cell. I don't know why I have put the information in the slideshow twice, but exactly that one sentence tells you the information that you need to know about a ribosome. It's quite detailed when we go into protein synthesis and talk about the different steps, which isn't necessarily part of natural science. It's more specific to life science, the FET phase subject, but very, very vital, and it's a very, very vital function of a cell. So ribosomes are tiny, and they're often found right throughout the cell, floating in the cytoplasm, and very, very close to the nucleus as well. And this is because in this process of protein synthesis, it starts off in the nucleus because ribosomes need some information from DNA, and this DNA is contained inside the nucleus. Okay, I'm going to move to the last little section to keep this nice and short, and so that when you watch the video, you don't fall asleep before I'm done. So we're going to move to the very last section, which is transport mechanisms. So when I'm talking about transport mechanisms, I mean transport mechanisms across the cellular membrane of a cell. So getting the cell, the stuff into the cell and out of the cell. So when I say stuff, I mean different nutrients, even water, different ions. So all of these are transported by a certain mechanism, and this could just be because of the type of cell it is, or the different function the cell is busy performing at that stage. So the cell membrane is one of the great multitaskers of biology. Not only does it protect the cell, it provides the structure for the cell, protects cytosolic contents from the environment, and it allows the cells to act as specialized units. So a membrane is the cell's interface with the rest of the world. It's gatekeeper, if you will, or basically imagine how you would protect something important with security guards, like the Buckingham Palace, for example, with security guards protecting the royal family. So this cell membrane needs to protect our little royal family, our little organelles inside our cell. This phospholipid bilayer determines what molecules can move into or out of the cell, and so is in large part responsible for maintaining the delicate homeostasis of each cell. So homeostasis refers to maintaining the internal environment of a body, of a cell. So the cellular membrane is very, very important for homeostasis of the cell, to make sure that everything stays at the right level and right, let's say, pH and right composition for the cell to continue its functions. So we focus mainly on 5 different types of transport mechanisms in this module. The first one is simple diffusion. So there's 2 different types of diffusion that we talk about. Simple diffusion is the spread of molecules or particles from a region of high concentration to a region of low concentration. So for example, if you had a deodorant can and you had to poke a hole into it, the gas inside the can would disperse quite quickly. And this is because it's moving from a high concentration to a low concentration, the way that substances usually move. So again, simple diffusion, the spread of molecules from a region of high concentration to a region of low concentration. Then we get facilitated diffusion. So this is diffusion that is helped along, facilitated by a membrane transport channel. These channels are glycoproteins, proteins with carbohydrates attached that allow molecules to pass through the membrane. So as much as substances move automatically from high concentration to low concentration, these little glycoproteins in the cellular membrane control this movement. So even if something is at a high concentration, moving into or out of the cell to get to a low concentration, if this glycoprotein is not allowing it, it won't go through the cellular membrane. Then we want to move to active transport. So active transport is now the opposite. It's the movement of ions or molecules across a cell membrane into a region of higher concentration. So it needs to be assisted by enzymes, and it requires energy since the movement is against the concentration gradients. So if you're basically swimming upstream, you're going to need a lot more energy. You're going to need a lot more assistance than what you would need if you were doing what is natural. And that what's natural is diffusion, and active transport requires assistance. Endocytosis. So endocytosis is the taking in of matter by a living cell by invagination of its membrane to form a vacuole. So this is basically when the cell engulfs another object or matter, basically hugs it and makes it part of that cell. So it's almost like, I guess you can imagine the swallowing. If a cell could swallow, if it had a mouth and all of that, well, let's personify a cell. If a cell can bring another part of matter into itself, we call it endocytosis. And then the opposite of endocytosis is exocytosis, which is a process by which the contents of a cell vacuole are released to the exterior through fusion of the vacuole membrane with the cell membrane. So this is like pushing it out again. So when it engulfs it, endocytosis, it forms a vacuole around whatever matter. A vacuole would be a fluid-filled sac. So when it is releasing it, exocytosis, again, the vacuole merges with the cell membrane and it lets it go, pushes it out. Okay, so we've gone through in this lesson the different terminology referring to a cell, basic cell, prokaryotic, eukaryotic, and what an enzyme is, and metabolic processes. We've also gone through the different organelles, not all of the organelles, just the main ones that are quite necessary for understanding, and then the different transport mechanisms across the cellular membrane. So in our next lesson, we will continue into a little bit more detail, especially about cellular respiration done by the mitochondria and photosynthesis done by the chloroplast. Thank you very much for joining me today. We'll chat again next time.